and welcome to The Art of Being Human. On the last segment, I started talking about the brain, and I'm going to continue with that today. And I really think, in reference to what I said in the last show, if we taught children what stage of development they're in, when they're old enough to learn, then they would have an easier path through their adolescence because they would understand why they feel a certain way, why they do certain things, why there's conflict between them and their parents. And it would be easier to work with them. They would have an easier time. The parents would have an easier time. So I really do think that if schools could produce a program, and it would have to be maybe an ongoing program that might last not just 1 year, but more years, or maybe a few months out of a school a year, in terms of where a child is in their development and what is normal for them, which seems that mature for them, but it's not. A child can be manipulated into doing all kinds of things because they don't have a sense of resistance to things. And this is what I want to start off with today. If a child will understand this is the way you feel now, and it's perfectly normal and perfectly natural for you to feel that way. So you validate their feelings. You know, everybody needs to have their feelings validated. Their feelings are real. And to say, no, 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 when you're older you won't feel that way, I don't think that's the way to go at it. I've had a girl come to me when I was a college professor saying, I've fallen in love with my English professor, and I want to know if there's a chance that I can have a relationship with him. Now, I didn't say, oh, don't be silly, you're just a teenager, you're just a young person. You know, I never did any of that. I just very gently talked to her and told her, you know, that does happen. People do fall in love with people that take care of them or teach them or handle their medical issues. It's not unusual for a girl to fall in love with her doctor. It's not unusual for a child to fall in love with their teacher. It's a part of thing. It's just a part of growing up. But that doesn't mean you'd have a relationship with them, although it's not impossible. Nothing is impossible. If you're old enough and he's interested and you're interested and you're both of legal age, and of course the teacher would be, and the student as a college student might well be of legal age, there's always a possibility of something happening. But it usually just doesn't work out. And these are the reasons why it usually doesn't work out. So don't plan on anything, but on the other hand, just do your work and be the student that you need to be and just see what unfolds. And later on, she was interested in somebody else and she lost her interest in a professor. But at the time that a person is going through that, that's very important to them, and that's very real to them, and we can't naysay that and say, oh, you're just a kid, or say something that doesn't make sense, because they are going through it, and if you're going through something, it's real. Perception is everything. How you perceive something really is how you believe and how you feel, and the perceptions are there, and to pretend that they're not, or to pretend that they're not important or they're not real, just doesn't cut it. Because they are real and they are there, and you have to deal with it. So if we had a program whereby students as they're going through school understand this is where you are, and there's a lot of variation, so we don't want to overly pinpoint something either, but this is about the range that you're in, and this is how you're feeling, and I understand that, and that's normal for your age, and you don't have to be afraid of it, you don't have to be ashamed of it, but it's not your full maturity either. As you get older, other things will come to play. You'll know new things. You'll travel. You'll see new people, you know, and things will change. But they don't realize that because it hasn't happened yet. You can only realize what has happened. And if something hasn't happened, then it's just not there yet. So let's look back at this chart. The young brain is created to experience trust and innocence. This is the way children are. This is the way they should be. And They can, however, be manipulated to do a lot of things, but they do not have an understanding of when they're being manipulated. They do not have a resistance. So this is something they have to be taught too. If somebody tells you that they're wonderful and they're on the internet, don't just assume that that's the case. You need to have kind of a guard around you so that you can find out, is a person who they say they are. If I had a child, I would probably really limit their internet use to facts, things they could look up for classes and things like that, and try not to let them get too involved with people that they have never seen, because it's unsafe. And you don't want to teach a child to be afraid of everything, but you don't want to teach a child to trust everything either. I think it really is a balancing act. What a child understands, what they feel, what they think, that's normal for them, that really shouldn't be changed because it's a part of their natural development, and they have to go through that stage before they go to another stage of development. And I know in this show, at some point, I'm not going to do it right away, but I'm going to go through all the developmental phases of the human being, from conception all the way up through elderly years and death. And I'm going to do that because I think people need to know where they are on the scale, and it does keep changing. So I think it would be helpful, but I have a lot of other things I need to get into first, but at some point I will do that. So children can be manipulated, and that's one of the reasons they have to be protected. This is what parents are for. Protect your child. Know that they can be manipulated, and know that you have to help them guard against that, because they can't do it themselves, because the brain development is such that they're not able to. When you understand what your child and your teenager cannot do, not because they're being a smart aleck, they can't do it because their brain just isn't developed enough for it, then you can act as a guard for them, because that's what they need. Okay. And I mentioned before, as far as development is concerned of children, it's as if you're driving a car but a wire is missing. Does the car work? Yes, it does work, but it's bumpy. It's not smooth. It doesn't work exactly right, and that's what it is. It's not, the child is not mature, so they're not thinking exactly like a mature child or a mature person, because they cannot do it. Do not expect them to do it. I had a talk with my nephew's wife, and they had a son who was entering into teenage years, and they said, he's changed, he's not the same. And this is what we're running into, and we're afraid he's going to end up by being a bad kid and all of this. So I had a long talk with her about where he was in the developmental stage, and I said, he is maybe 11 or 12. He's entering into teenagerhood. His brain is not developed. It will not be developed for another 10 or 15 years. When you consider a 12-year-old, the brain doesn't fully develop until mid-20s, 25 or so. That's quite a distance, that's quite a number of years. And he can't think like an adult. He can't act like an adult. He's not an adult. His brain has not developed enough to be an adult. And the brain is rewiring. Remember, the brain goes from back to front. It develops from back to front. And the last part of the brain to develop is the frontal cortex, which does all of the understanding, the decisions, the consequences of decisions, being able to make normal decisions, careful decisions, not based on impulse. That kind of thing doesn't come with the teenage brain. They're just not there yet. And so therefore I talked with her a long time about the stage of development he was in, the changes she could expect. But the thing is, I think he needed to understand that too, because if he understood what was going on, then he would be more sensitive to what his parents were telling him. They were good parents. He was a good kid. There was nothing wrong with him. He was just growing up. That's all it was. Kids do have a tendency to do that, Some children and some adults do this too, mix up real and imaginative things. They can't understand what's real and what's not real. And if a person has emotional disturbances, this may well be a part of their problem, is the fact that they are mixing up what's real with what's not real. If you think something, does that make it true? You know, there are children who think, if I think this, it's going to come to pass because I thought it. Or maybe a more negative example would be, you know, I thought about somebody being in an accident. And it turns out they were in an accident. Was that my fault? Did I cause the accident? I thought of it. Well, it wasn't their fault. Thinking of it doesn't necessarily make it so. But to a developing brain, they don't understand the difference. Their brains aren't developed enough to quite understand that. And here's where a course or a good parent steps in and say, just because you think of something doesn't mean that it's going to happen as you think it. If it does, it's going to feel like you had something to do with it, but it doesn't mean you had anything to do with it. Things happen by accident. Things happen just because they happen, and we can't judge when things are going to happen. And we don't predict when things are going to happen. At least most of us don't. Some people have a knack for it, but most of us don't. So therefore, just because you think of something doesn't mean that that something's going to happen. And if it does happen, you didn't cause it. Children blame themselves for divorces. They blame themselves for abuse. If only I'd been a better person. If only I'd been stronger. If only I had said no. But a person who is weaker or more vulnerable or younger cannot defend against somebody who is older, stronger, more manipulative in terms of how they handle things. And it's not the child or the person who's been abused. It's not their fault. There's no equal power base between a perpetrator and a person who's a victim. There's no equal power base. And I spend half my time when I counsel children. It's not your fault your parents are divorced. You could not have stopped it. There's nothing that you did to cause it. But here it's a case of a developing brain does not know the difference. They can't tell the difference because the brain is not mature enough to do it. And it's something that we have to understand about growing up. Okay. People with emotional disorders and brain injuries don't think realistically because they can't. It's a part of their illness, and that can be reflected in their speech, in their thought, and even in their artwork. So I want to show you a couple of things, a couple of pictures. I don't know if you can zero in. If a person is emotionally ill, their thoughts and feelings can be reflected in the way they talk, in the way they write, in the way that they draw, in their artwork especially. There's a whole segment of psychology that's based upon artwork and what it reveals about people, their moods, their mental disorders, and so forth. So I would just want to show you a couple of examples of that. Here is a painting of a cat. I'm going to move this a little. Maybe this is better so we can get it maybe more centered. This is a picture of a cat. Now, you can see some cat features, can't you? If you look at it, the eyes, the ears, you know, there's a little nose here, there's a little mouth here. So that is a cat, but there's so much extra. There's so much extra color, extra lines that if it didn't have a core of something that you could nab as being a cat, you wouldn't even know what it was. This painting was done by Louis Wayne, and he was a schizophrenic. Now, if we look at the bottom one, this is a very familiar one. It's called The Scream by Edward Munch. And there's a person here screaming, and you can see all of this. This represents blood, and it's a psychotic drawing as well. And what I have read, and I don't have any proof of this, but what I have read is that he saw his mother hemorrhage to death, and there was a lot of blood. He went insane, And as a result of that, this is one of the pictures, and she is screaming, supposedly. I mean, you can see the mouth is open, the hands are up. You know, I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear it, but that's called a scream, and it was a psychotic. Drawing. And supposedly the mother bled to death as she was giving birth to a baby. So if a young child saw that, that would be extremely traumatic. And here again, I want to mention something about traumatic brain injuries. If you have seen something terrible and you're hooked on it, you know, you can't get it out of your mind, you're thinking about it all the time, that you can get a brain injury from that. It's not like being beat up, it's not like being hit on the head, but you can get a brain injury from that. And you can get, the brain does respond to what it sees. The brain responds to what it happens to the individual. The brain responds, it's a responsive organ. It just doesn't record like a recorder, it is a responsive organ. And so you can get an injury from some of these things. PTSD people have brain injuries, but it's healable. And it's not like you don't have the, it's not like you don't have the cells, it's not like you don't have the brain development, but something happens and you can't respond normally, the brain is injured at that point, but it's very healable. With the right kind of treatment, it is very healable. Okay, parents need to guide their children. They need to teach responsibility. They need to encourage their children. Even if the child does not understand, even if they resist, it is the parent's responsibility to step in. Too many parents try to make their friends. And when they try to make their children their friends, they're missing something because their children can't be their friends. I actually knew a lady who would ask advice of her 4-year-old. Do you think I should do this now? I'm making up the name Brian. I don't remember the name of the child. Do you think I should do this now or should I do this later? And she's having this conversation in my office with a 4-year-old. I says, you're asking your 4-year-old son to make decisions. Yeah, he has a good grasp on things. No, he doesn't. He's 4 years old. He can't have a good grasp on things. He's looking at things from his 4-year-old mind. He's far from developed into a full-scale human being. He's a human being, yes, but as far as brain development is concerned, he's got a perfectly normal 4-year-old brain, but that's not like a 26-year-old brain. But she would ask his advice, and he would give it to her. I'm thinking, this is nuts. You know, so one of the things I had to do was to teach her that you have an adult brain, your 4-year-old doesn't. You need to make decisions. You need to make the best decisions you can make. And you need to make them for him as well as for yourself because he's not capable of doing it, certainly not at 4 years old. So the parents have to step in and they have to be parents. That doesn't mean being mean. It doesn't mean being rude, but just to kind of talk to them. This is what your brain can do, but this is what you can't do because you're not old enough. And I know you feel old enough, and I know you think you have control over everything, and nothing's going to hurt you, and you can kind of plow your way through life, and everything's going to be all right. That's not what happens. It's what you feel happens, and maybe it's what should happen, but it's not what happens. And you have to deal with life realistically. That's all there is to it. You have to deal with life realistically, but you can do so and discuss these things with them with an understanding. You know, I understand where you are. I understand why you feel the way you do. And if I were your age, I'd feel that way too. In fact, I did feel that way when I was your age. But now that I'm older, things are different, and you will experience that too. But right now you can't sense that out because your brain hasn't developed to the point where you can feel that out. And that's not a negative statement. You can be a very sharp, very brilliant person, but your brain doesn't necessarily fully develop until you're in your mid-20s. It's just a fact of the matter. So at about age 25, the brain is mature. And if it has not been traumatized, then it will act as a normal brain. If the brain is not ill, you don't have a brain tumor, if you haven't been traumatized, if you don't have PTSD, which is something happening outside of yourself, if your biochemistry is normal, so you're not psychotic because something's wrong with the way the brain is working, because it's not working right, because the brain chemistry is off, given all of these ifs, you have a normal brain by age 25. Congratulations, you made it. Now, when I started teaching, I was about 20 years old. I'd gotten my college degree, and I went to the North, what we call the North Country in this state, and I taught. And the kids there thought I was one of them. I looked as young as they did, and I wasn't really fully mature. As I look back on it, I can see that I was not fully mature. Nonetheless, I had a fine time teaching. They liked me, I liked them, and it worked out well. But as I think back to my thoughts and feelings, I recognize that I wasn't fully mature at age 21. Nobody is. We have 18 years of age as a legal age of maturity, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is, of course, before that age, you really aren't mature. At age 18, you're much closer to being there, but now we know that the age of maturity is even later than age 18. How many of us know 18-year-olds that don't seem to quite be mature? Okay, abuse causes us not to be normal. Marriage problems cause us not to be normal. If you're married and the marriage is going south, then the energy that you would put into having a creative marriage goes toward the stabilization of the marriage. In other words, if you're married, a good marriage, you are creative, your spouse is creative, you support each other in your creativity, then if something goes wrong, all of that creative energy that you would use to mature, to do new things, to have new projects, maybe to go back to school, all of that is shunted down, and the energy is put into trying to stabilize the marriage. So you lose your creative juices, so to speak, to try to stabilize the marriage. So it's important. We are an energy system. We have so much energy. Where do we put our energy? If we're in trouble, it's toward the trouble. If we're not in trouble, then we're free to grow and develop. All the more reason that we need to understand the brain and everything that it's about. Well, I'm going to stop it here. We're running out of time. And next time I'm going into drugs. What do they do to a developing brain? What happens when you take drugs? I'm going to start off with marijuana because this state is trying to decide whether to legalize marijuana for recreational use. And I really feel that people need to understand what it does, because who's going to be using the marijuana? A lot of teenagers, older teenagers, young adults that brains are still developing, and it has a really detrimental effect. So we'll be starting that next week. Please join me then.